SYS presents Adventures in Online Education.
Welcome, online educators. You're listening to SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. I'm your host, Natalie Conway. Thanks for being here. If you're new to the podcast, first off, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. If you want, head over to aoepodcast.org and enter your info at the bottom of the page to start receiving the AOE newsletter. It's a little piece of positivity for your inbox from me to you. Returning listeners, I appreciate you very much. On to today's episode, my guest today is Cassie Pierce. This is her 8th year teaching. She has experience teaching both upper and lower elementary in very different school settings, from private to public to charter, with an equal amount of time both in person and online. She went back to school to become a teacher while working full-time at a not-for-profit hospice where she worked for 6 years. Cassie volunteered after work for a children's bereavement support group, and this experience, coupled with her time in classrooms, inspired her to pursue an education degree. Cassie is also an instructional coach for online teachers. Today, Cassie and I talk about all things class culture and relationship building. You are going to feel like you've just received the biggest hug by the end of this episode. So, you ready? Let's learn something new. Hi, Cassie. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast today and talking with me. I'm so thankful that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I am excited to dive right in. I know this is a topic you have a lot of passion about and a lot of knowledge about as well. It might be kind of the middle of the year practically now, but oftentimes we spend the first weeks of school building routines and trying to get to know our students. But it's always a good time to keep doing that and to keep connecting with kids. In the online setting, it can really be a challenge to get to know our students. What strategies do you have for online teachers who want to get to know their students and, at elementary especially, their families?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I personally view teachers and families as a team. I communicate this right away, not just with my words, but with my actions. So, this does not mean that every lesson or decision will or should be a team decision, but it means that each person impacts the learning of the child in really profound ways. We know that learning is not done in isolation. So, the first step to a positive classroom culture is really to recognize and communicate this to families. They want to know that we are on their side. Meaningful classroom culture will extend beyond the classroom. So we know this. I know if I make a difference, a family member might tell me how their child helped them maintain a growth mindset in their own life, or, the student applied a fraction concept or decimals in the grocery store. So if we agree that learning should continue when school is out, we really need to see families as an important part of this process. So, to that end, classroom communication is really essential to forming a strong bond. Right away at the start of the school year, I strive to get to know the families and their experiences with school. And I do that with either a welcome call or a Zoom meeting. I also share a little bit about myself as a person as well. I want families to tell me about their child, not just academically, but some of their interests as well. So, I really like to be creative and find ways for children to utilize their strengths to make growth. If a child struggles with math, or maybe they dislike reading, but they love soccer, I might create a soccer word problem for math or recommend a book about soccer to appeal to their interest. So it's important for me to get to know them as a whole child, but also so that I can help them academically as well. I want to know families' goals and what they feel their child needs to be successful. And then I follow up with resources or a plan to address any areas of academic concerns as soon as possible. For example, I might email some tools like text to speech or other Chrome extensions to support their child, or I might recommend IXL areas to make progress in math. If the concern is more complex, I may reach out to other team members like the school counselor or our special education teacher to set up a future meeting. But I think it's important to recognize that these actions communicate my intentions more than words alone. I want families to feel that we are a team from day one. And I think it's one thing to reach out and say that you care. And then it's another to really follow through with actionable items. And I feel like that is how you build trust with families. I like to think about this like when we as adults go to the doctor or really to any other professional and we have a concern that we would like to address. We know that we may not solve every problem in one visit, or get to know each other completely, but it's important to have a realistic plan to stay on track. And it's important to be heard with real compassion. So we know when someone is listening to us with real compassion. And I want to give the families the same level of respect and care that I expect from others in my own life. So to me, consistency is really the key to starting and maintaining that strong communication and trust. I email students and families a group email, and they can expect this on the same day and time every week. It's just part of our routine. And in that email is a brief update about the activities in each class, so a little bit of an overview about what we're doing in each subject. And then another thing that I do is I strive to give families notice. So whenever we are going to read materials or work on activities that I think might be more controversial in nature, things like issues of bullying or prejudice, traumatic historical events, grief or loss, or even holiday references. And again, this comes from knowing your families, their religious beliefs, their preferences, and concerns. And just keep in mind that these notifications do not need to be personalized. We have limited time as teachers and we do our best. Just a simple group email with privacy protected can give families options to preview a text before it's read in class and notify the teacher of any concerns. And this will maintain relationships in really a proactive way rather than a reactive way. And that's important to me. If a family does reach out and has a concern, I strive to be open minded and to provide alternative topics or texts when appropriate while we still meet the objectives. So, again, it's not necessarily completely a team decision, but it's something that we can have an open dialogue about. So, why are we studying this topic if there is a concern about it? And then I try to meet families halfway and really respect the differences between us. Another thing that I feel is really important is the words that we use in live class and in our emails. So the words we use make a difference, and it can be hard to read tone in an email.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's kind of challenging for all of us. How do I word this in a way that conveys my true intentions, and how do they get to know me and that we are on the same team? So one of the things I do is to be really mindful to use words like families rather than parents. We want to keep in mind that some kids live with their grandparents or other adults. And so just thinking about the diversity of the different family situations and, thinking about too, the teamwork, it's especially important in an online setting in which the family member at home might take on a more direct role in the day to day learning process. And this may be something they have experience with, or it might be new to them. So I want to make sure that I don't assume that they know, certain technology tools or that they've done this before, that they've supported their student in this way. So I do have a page of resources to support families as needed, which I link inside of Canvas. And some of the different resources might be, reading fluency websites for helpful tips on how to practice math. There might be some information how to chunk assignments or build stamina, where to go for technology help. So we really need to think about the fact that teachers online may need to be an instructional coach to families, especially at the primary level in which the family member may be more involved directly with the student. And so just being there for the families too, when I send an email, I'm really thinking about my audience being both the students, since it's upper elementary for me, but at the families as well. So really addressing it to both of them. And then if I have something I just need to send to families, I send that out separately.
I love all that you're saying here, and I think so much of it is obviously relevant to elementary teachers and families, but also secondary as well. I think what you said about agreeing that learning doesn't stop at the end of the school day and really partnering with families to support students, that's awesome. And the idea of being proactive rather than reactive and communicating clearly and consistently your expectations or what's happening next. It sounds to me like you do a lot of listening. Like you ask for information or you interview, but that you do a lot of genuine listening with care and then pair your actions to your words. I really liked what you said about that because we can all say, oh, I want to make an inclusive culture. I want everyone to feel comfortable, or I'm trying to get to know my kids, but you have to do it and follow through. And it's clear that that's what you're doing. It sounds like in getting to know your students and their families that you do a lot to build a positive culture within your online classroom. Class culture is really important for many reasons. Kids learn when they feel welcomed, safe, and like they belong. What specific things do you do to build a solid, positive class community in your online classroom?
Well, I agree with you that a positive classroom culture is one in which the students feel valued and academically challenged at the level that they are at. So I refer to this classroom as a school family. And we start the year with a really fun Canvas discussion board where students can share their interests and hobbies with their school family. And they're usually eager to do this. And they can do it either with a video or in written form. There's sentence stems to help them. And then I keep this discussion actually available for the entire school year, and it's basically our virtual connection spot. This helps students to stay on topic in class because they know this is another place that they can go to share with their peers after they finish their assignments. I also open up my classroom 10 minutes early for unstructured social time, and I've made a habit of doing this. For each class, it's a good way for students to make sure that technology is working, to get adjusted to class starting, which we all need sometimes at the start of the day.
Indeed.
And then it's also just a really fun time for them to share and get to know each other as well as get to know the teacher too. And I have noticed that I tend to have pretty strong attendance in my class, and I feel like opening up my classroom 10 minutes early is a part of this, that it's made a positive difference. And then when we're in class, students have class jobs. So I really want to build ownership. We rotate class jobs, and I know that this is challenging, particularly if you have certain class sizes. So some teachers might be wondering how, is this going to be realistic doing this online with the number of students that I have? So just think about the different ways that you could utilize class jobs. I have students take turns to help keep the chat on topic. We call that point keeper. And we save up for little sharing parties, which essentially is just extra sharing time. And we might have a theme like silly hats or silly hair. I have students that are hand monitors. They call on volunteers to share ideas, or they might lead an exercise break. And then we have group jobs as well, because it's really pretty challenging to try to have a number of individual jobs depending on your class size. So we utilize the millionaire format for students to phone a friend. They don't actually phone a friend, but they can call in a helper in class if they are stuck on how to solve a math problem. And then the guidelines I have for that is they may share a math strategy and collaborate, but not the answer. You might be able to call in someone to choral read with you. So again, each student is still expected to participate, but I never want them to feel like they're put on the spot. That's really important to me, and that's part of that building safety, which we talked about as important to class culture. So sometimes, they even ask the audience, the entire class in the chat, and again, they are to share strategies or ideas, but not the answer. And we have other ways to participate as well. So if your camera is on in Zoom, you can use nonverbal sign language to share ideas. We use yes or no signals. We might even do things like tip our thinking cap, just different ways that students can feel like they are communicating to me and I am giving them informal feedback, even if not everyone has a chance to answer on the microphone. And then in addition, because, being challenged is really important, I want to make sure that I'm being inclusive of all the different skill levels in class. And, that in and of itself can be challenging when you have certain objectives that you are trying to cover in your lesson. But something that I do, no matter what subject I'm teaching, whether it's science or math or English, I provide sentence stems. And those sentence stems are there to help students as needed, but it is not required to use them. Recently, I saw a student making her own sentence stems to help others.
Nice.
Yeah, so the goal would be that, eventually students may not need that, but it's just a nice way for them to feel safe and to make the directions clear. Speech therapists have said that that is also a really helpful strategy to be inclusive to students that might have some communication learning needs. I also offer, students can share their ideas in writing. They can use the microphone. They can utilize the review or challenge options in the slides or in the activities that we're doing. So maybe we're doing decimal addition, and if this is something that you have mastered, the problems that we are going over as a class, I really want you to deepen your analysis and maybe solve this problem for a larger number of people. If you need to review, you could just add 2 decimals at a time. And that way we are still meeting the objectives, but it's really making it more inclusive for a wider number of students. And then likewise, I try to offer those same types of options for submission in Canvas. We have sit and stems if students need them. There's review and challenge options, and multiple ways that you can show your understanding depending upon the objective. So if it's appropriate, you could share your answer via a video. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in writing unless the objective is to assess the writing. I also make sure that I give detailed feedback for students, and I do that both in Canvas and then also just recognizing students in class. So using their names is really important. And I make an effort to give sincere praise to families periodically too. I think that that's something that, a lot of teachers, we might feel like, well, it's hard to find the time to do that, but we know that it's important. So even just sending a brief note to families to say something that you noticed in class is really valuable to the families. It shows that you care, and it really shows that we as teachers can reach out not just when we have a concern, but also to recognize what is working well and what we appreciate. And I think that's part of showing gratitude too, and just getting to know your school community. Another thing that's really important to me to keeping that positive classroom culture is really to think about supplies. So it's important for me to offer multiple supply options for students. We cannot assume that families have certain supplies at home. And if we do, that is a way that a student may not have access to an assignment and they might feel embarrassed or unable to reach out. So, whenever possible, I list multiple options for art supplies, or students can create their own from recycled materials. So, for science, kids can use any experiment to apply to the scientific method. I have a scientific method discussion board in homeroom, and I may give some epic books or some Newsella articles with different ideas for experiments, but it's really up to the student and their family to decide what supplies they have at home, what experiment they would like to do. And then I tell students, if you have family permission and you want to do an experiment, but you don't have all the supplies, you can still do it, but just think about substitutions and how that might impact the outcome of the experiment. So they're still learning about the scientific method. They're just making some changes, and it really doesn't change the outcome. They're just deepening their understanding by making some of these substitutions. And I feel that it's more inclusive for kids with these options.
Absolutely. I love that word inclusive. You've used it a few times, and it's exactly what it sounds like you do. Being so respectful of the diversity of students in your classroom, as well as the diversity of the families with whom you work. It's really incredible. It's bringing back things that Katie Novak and I talked about earlier this season in an episode about universal design for learning. It's reminding me about awesome things Nefertiti Duke said, who came on to talk about Screencastify and access and equity in education there as well. So this is really cool. It's so clear to me that you have such a high level of respect for your families, and that with that comes flexibility in how you work with them and how you allow them to work with the curriculum and the assignments. And that is just straight up good for kids. So that's awesome.
Wow, thank you.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about diverse learners and being culturally responsive and a few other things before we wrap up. So stick with us. What's the one thing all online schools and programs struggle with? Student engagement and the ability to truly personalize interventions. How do we solve those problems? With the use of Admin Dash, a brand new Canvas LTI tool from SYS Education. Admin Dash allows online teachers to see a risk assessment score that proactively identifies students who may need more specialized attention or intervention, and offers a communication log that provides an outlet for complete transparency among teachers, admin, students, and families. At just 99 cents per student per year, and with no minimum price and no fees, you can't afford to not use Admin Dash. For more information about Admin Dash, contact sales@syseducation.org and start connecting proactively with your online learners. Before the break, I was saying how Cassie's brilliant and thoughtful words were reminding me of what we've talked about already on the podcast about UDL and access. What about meeting the needs of diverse learners, both culturally and academically? How do online teachers ensure that the curriculum is responsive, both culturally and designed in such a way that it's accessible to all? That seems like a really heavy lift. How do you maneuver that?
Well, these are really important considerations for teachers, especially as they build curriculum. I don't have a simple answer to what is a culturally responsive curriculum. It's really more about the question itself. I see this for me personally as a lifelong journey. So rather than a destination in a lesson, a unit, or even a school year, I feel like my answers should continually evolve and change as I open up my mind to perspectives that are dramatically different from my own. And then likewise, my goal is really to instill a desire for students to continually question, explore, and value diversity rather than seek to define someone else's viewpoint through their own biases and experiences. So it's really important to listen. And so, where do we start? Some questions that come to my mind are how can any teacher encompass the complexity of culture into a lesson or even a unit? What would you include? What would you leave out and why? How do we know our own biases and experiences are not in the way? We want to teach students to think for themselves. How do we honor the different beliefs in a classroom as we approach these really challenging topics and what we can see as a politically tense climate that we live in today? And then, furthermore, how do elementary teachers make this age appropriate? So, here, family communication is really key. So, giving families an ability to preview a text and being open to a difference in beliefs or a difference in opinion and still finding ways to meet them in the middle and meet the objectives is really important. So, I created a module about human rights for fifth grade English with all of these questions in the back of my mind. My module was loosely based on an outline of a unit in a wonderful open educational resource, Engage New York. My first step at the start of the module was really to ask a question. So I had kids define, what is human rights? And then I wanted them to define what rights we should all be entitled to and why, with my goal really for students to end up with more questions and answers at the end of the modules, doing some deeper thinking. There's not necessarily answers to everything that we're studying, but really instilling in them a desire to explore is important. So it was interesting to hear the answers they came up with. Some students started with answers about toys. They felt like everyone should be entitled to toys. And then we went a bit deeper. Yeah, we get to a place that we started, and then we found, let's go a little bit deeper. What is absolutely essential to your health? What about your emotional health? And so we talked about things like shelter, clean water, communication, and then even dignity. So many students were surprised to find that not everyone has access to these rights. And this led to the big question, why? Now the door is open to explore different aspects of history and to hear voices they may not have been exposed to before, because we were able to start to see someone else's perspective with an emotional connection. And so when I think about a culturally responsive curriculum, to me, it's also about academic accessibility. We start with a study of educational rights after we explore what are human rights, and we talk about learning differences. And so this is a module that for me takes place at the start of the school year. And it's also a way for us to build community within the classroom. We examine nonfiction articles about the creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, assistive devices, and we read different books about the history of Braille and sign language, among other topics. We combine this with a module about growth mindset in another class, homeroom, and we talk about how a growth mindset really impacts the brain. Later in English, we have a fiction novel study of the text Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper, in which we hear the internal dialogue of a nonverbal student with limited mobility. So we really experience the miscommunications in the novel through her eyes, and students come to define education and really communication rights too, in ways they may never have thought of before through this internal dialogue and someone else's unique perspective. So the end goal is for students to understand that no human ever can ever possibly define the depths of someone else's intelligence or personality. Therefore, there is no one right way to learn. And my goal is for students to carry this lesson with us into all of our other lessons throughout the school year in different classes. We practice sign language, we clap in sign language as others are attempting to tackle a challenging math problem. We focus on the effort rather than perfection. We talk a lot about how mistakes are essential, particularly in math. Otherwise, you are not learning and growing. And so we really focus on that growth mindset. And I have found that students are more open to the options I offer for support after this discussion. So, Chrome extensions, voice typing, audiobooks, etc. is needed. As there's really no stigma, more students start to open up about their own learning needs. And so for me, that's the solid foundation that we want to build in order to have some of these more difficult conversations. So after a study of educational rights, we continue to study diverse experiences and social injustices and other lessons. So some of the other topics we study in depth are Native American history, the Long Walk, and we contrast this with other historical events such as the Japanese American Relocation Act. And really, students become advocates for change. They become very passionate about human rights. It's not just words to them, it means something through the lens of others' experiences and our own. And through that, we really celebrate diversity with projects and research.
That sounds outstanding. And what grade level is this?
Oh, thank you. I apologize. I didn't even mention it. Fifth grade. I currently teach fifth grade.
Wow, that is amazing to hear that those students are exploring these kinds of ideas and challenging their own preconceived notions, or even just learning that the world is bigger than their current view, right? Just seeing that there are other ways to be and that there are other cultures.
I think all of us, I'm learning different cultural traditions from students or just different ways of looking at the world. And so it's a great way for us as a whole school family, even the families, to really connect to each other on a deeper level and make progress that's hard to define just academically, but you can really see it in the way they treat each other in all the classes.
Absolutely, especially as divided and kind of right and wrong as we feel in the US right now. It's really refreshing to hear you speak about listening to different perspectives and learning from one another and finding the truth in what others are saying and honoring that as well. I also am just so blown away that your goal was to have kids end with more questions than answers. That's awesome that at the end of this module, this unit, they are asking more and more questions because they're thinking so deeply about how the world works and how people move through life and in this world. That is remarkable. The other thing you said that there is no one right way to learn. Love that. Absolutely love that. It really rings true to me as a special education teacher. Natalie Vardabasso has been on the podcast before. She has her own EduCrush podcast and talks about that a lot as well, that when we talk about disability rights or when we talk about students with special needs, we have this perception of the way that we're supposed to learn or the way that we're supposed to do things, and there really isn't. That's just a construct. And so breaking that down, I just finished reading a book by Alice Wong called Disability Visibility. And Cassie, if you haven't read it, you'll love it. I'll have to send it to you. But it's really talks a lot. It's all first person essays by people who have disabilities. And it really opens your eyes to the ableism that is in our society and then how we can work to bring greater access to everyone and bring better equity in our spheres of influence. So, a really cool read if anyone's interested in that. The work you're doing with kids is remarkable, and we are so thankful for you. I have one final question that I'm asking all my guests this season, and I'm so curious to ask you about this. Who is your favorite teacher as a kiddo and why? What was their impact on you?
Well, one early memory that stands out to me is actually about a teacher that I did not have myself as a child, but she later became a really important part of my decision to become an educator. So I actually first met Mrs. Mings when I visited her classroom for art, and I was just in first grade. I remember that I cut out a shape wrong, or I perceived it to be wrong. And so while other students were laughing at me, she held it up and the room was silenced because she carefully praised in detail my unique perspective. And in that moment, I realized I had never met anyone like her who looked at things from multiple angles like that. And so what she was saying was sincere, but it was done in such a way that I felt like I had more confidence to try to tackle the assignment. And then later in high school, I volunteered in her classroom every day for credit. So I learned that she had a background in the medical field before she became an educator. That was really fascinating to me. She had created her lessons with holistic child development goals in mind. So there was a lot more going on behind the surface than just what the lesson itself appeared to be. And I learned a lot from her about how children learn and the science of the brain. Actually, years later, I would think about that when I was in college, and I learned more from her in my time volunteering in her classroom in a lot of ways than I did in some college classes later. She really invested a lot of time in me and helped me to see this potential that I had. Something else that I really admired about her was that she is an abstract thinker and she loves to be creative. So her classroom was really colorful. It was filled with art and quotes from around the world. Likewise, she had really strong relationships with the families in her room. Families were always welcome in her classroom. They would often volunteer. They were really a part of the classroom culture, and she honored that. Something really remarkable about her to me was that she poured her heart and her soul into absolutely everything she did for students. I don't think she could have taught any other way. This was just who she was. And actually, she ended up encouraging both my mother and I to go into education. So, my mother was the office manager at the school when she decided to go to college. She would work with kids and she would ask them, what they wanted to be when they grew up. And most students told her, I don't know. Or, in fact, they felt that college was not accessible to them. This particular school was in an area with a lot of high poverty, and many students just felt that was not a goal that they could reach. So my mom wanted to be someone that could help kids create goals and reach them. And in fact, she was the first person in our entire family to get a college degree. And she since then has really paved the way for the rest of us. So my mother has since been a TOSA, so a teacher on special assignment. She has mentored adults and taught several different grade levels. My mother is really my inspiration, but Mrs. Mings is as well. She's a special person to us both, as she recognized the potential we each had inside of us to help others. And I really feel like she brought out the best in us. Now we strive to do that for students. She helped me to feel more confident and just to recognize that we all learn in different ways and we have different unique gifts to give to people, and I don't have to have all the answers to be a teacher. There's things that I have to give to students, and just really made me feel like this was a good occupation for me to go into, coupled with what she taught me about the brain and how children learn. So I'm really very grateful for her. And I often think about her when I'm teaching, and I think about what would Mrs. Mings do in this situation, and how would she make this, inclusive for students. And so this was in-person learning, but there's a lot of her traits that I try to also use in my own classroom to really make students feel safe and welcome in a positive community.
Well, she's definitely had an impact. Thank you, Mrs. Mings. We're so glad that you were a part of Cassie's life because Cassie's awesome and we get her as a result. Cassie, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Thank you so much for sharing your love and wisdom around working with kids and families. If anyone listening wants to get in touch with you, is there an email address or social media where they could reach you?
Oh, yes. I can be reached at my instructional coach email address, cpierce@syseducation.org. And that's cpierce@syseducation.org.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks again for your time today, Cassie. This was a really uplifting conversation.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. Special thanks to my lovely guest today, Cassie Pierce. Today we learned that partnering with families means really listening to them and pairing our actions with our words. Cassie taught us ways that we can be proactive in communicating with families and encouraged us to really see the humanity in our students and their families alike, as we teach our students to see the humanity of others. I hope you feel uplifted and inspired by Cassie's teacher heart and her words of empathy and wisdom. Thanks again for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please hit subscribe and give us a rating. On Twitter, you can follow me, Natalie Conway, at AOE Natalie, and the show at SYS Presents. If you're interested in finding out more about SYS Education, head to syseducation.org. This podcast wouldn't be possible without our exceptional team at SYS Education, including sound engineers Natalie Farrell and Matt Duran, and producer Bo Neal. Thanks for listening, and remember, we can learn new things.
for listening.